with the breaking news on Fox News. Here is what they reported.
Up that to 1.2 trillion. So President Trump is due here to address the troops here, soldiers and airmen, Al Udeid Air Base. But before coming here, President Trump spoke with business leaders in Qatar, where he says he's close to a nuclear deal with Iran. Of course, Iran not far away, and Qatar and Iran share the largest gas field in the Persian Gulf. That's why these countries want to see a deal happen. Here is President Trump earlier.
I think we're getting close to maybe doing a deal without having to do this. There's two steps. There's a very, very nice step, and there's a violent step. The violence like people haven't seen before. And I hope we're not going to have to do this. I don't want to do the second step. We're in very serious negotiations with Iran for long-term peace.
And keep in mind, guys, for context, it was just a few weeks ago when President Trump was posting on Truth Social about bombing Iran. Now you don't hear that word here in the region. In addition to the business deals, diplomacy on the agenda, President Trump meeting the new president of Syria in Riyadh, who 6 months ago had a $10 million bounty on his head, running an al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. Now he says he wants the U.S. to invest in his country, keep Iran out now that the Assad regime is gone. Trump said he will remove sanctions on Syria. Here's the president earlier here in Qatar.
Syria, we took out the sanctions, and that's been, I didn't even realize it's been many, many years that they've had sanctions. And as you know, there was a very big change at the top. And I thought that we have to give them a chance. They really have no chance with the sanctions.
Of course, those sanctions went back 4 decades, not just to Assad, but the whole Assad family. And now here's the headline from NBC. Top Iranian official says Tehran would forego highly enriched uranium and nuclear deal with Trump.
Yeah. Here is the top Iranian officials that they're talking about, and NBC reported, is Shamkhani. He's so much credible in whatever he says about the nuclear program of Iran. Your take, Ambassador.
So there are a number of comments I have. First, I wish people would learn to pronounce Qatar. It's not guitar or Qatar, which is a chest infection. Qatar is the way it's pronounced. Second, there's a lot of puffery in this, $1.2 trillion and so forth, $600 billion investment from Saudi Arabia, and so forth and so on. These are vague statements of intent, and they're not transactions, and they probably never will be transactions. But President Trump probably knows what Willie Sutton, the famous bank robber, said when he was apprehended by the FBI, and he was asked why he robbed banks. And he said, because that's where the money is. And the Gulf is where the money is. So that's where Mr. Trump is. With regard to the discussions with Iran, I think what we're hearing is two very typical Trump boosts to negotiation. The first is he reiterated the military threat. He did so with some subtlety, but it was very clear that he was continuing to threaten a military assault on Iran, even though apparently at least the B-52s have been removed from Diego Garcia. So the second thing he said was, well, we're very close to an agreement. This is very typical of Trump's efforts to boost the prospects of an agreement by being relentlessly optimistic. I don't think that's a description of what is happening in these talks. Finally, I don't think it's news that Iran is willing to give up highly enriched uranium. That has always been the Iranian position. It was only when the nuclear deal was trashed by Mr. Trump in his first administration that Iran proceeded to enrich to very close to the level where you could make weapons, about 60%. And it is said that Iran has about enough highly enriched uranium, 60%, to be able to build 6 bombs in a matter of days, not months or weeks. So Iran, I think, if according to what we heard from the first meeting with Mr. Witkoff in Muscat in Oman is prepared to go back to the pre-JCPOA level, which I think was 3.67% in the enrichment. That's enough to power a nuclear reactor, but not enough to build a bomb. And of course, Iran is prepared to accept intrusive inspection. In fact, inspections continue even now. So I don't think this is news, but I'm interested that Fox News quoted that, because Fox News is really a traditional opponent of the Iran nuclear deal. And now they're suggesting, by reporting that there could be a meeting of the minds around that. This goes contrary to the position of Israel and Israel's most ardent supporters in the United States, who basically make two arguments. One is that there should be no enrichment at all, no nuclear program at all in Iran, despite the fact that Iran, as a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT treaty, has the right to enrichment. And second, they argue, and Israel argues for the complete disarmament of Iran, basically destroying its missiles, ending its programs of support for the resistance to Israeli expansion in the Levant, and so forth. The second argument that people opposed to an agreement make is a legal one, and that is that the only agreement that can bind the United States is a treaty, and the Senate is not prepared to approve a treaty. Well, that may or may not be true. I think Mr. Trump does a lot by executive order. I imagine he's thought about that. But beyond that, he's also shown on a number of issues that he can not only make enormous mistakes that astonish everyone, but he can reverse those mistakes in an astonishing way. So he's a leader. He has almost a cult in the Republican Party in the Congress. And if he decides that he's got a deal that serves American interests as he sees them, I think he will be fearless in promoting that idea. So I think the naysayers need to be looked at with a grain of salt, just as Mr. Trump's optimism needs to be looked at with a grain of salt.
If we remember, in Donald Trump in his first term, he went to Saudi Arabia, to Israel, and to the region. It was so important in his first term as well. But right now, he's not going to go to Israel. What can we learn from that?
Well, I think it's often said that he's tired of dealing with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And that's very easy to understand, because Netanyahu doesn't keep his word. He's unreliable. He runs around behind the back of the president and puts pressure on him from the Zionist lobby in the United States. He is not a friend of the United States. He's a manipulator of the United States. And Mr. Trump doesn't like to be manipulated. But there's a history here. Mr. Netanyahu agreed to Trump's special envoy, private envoy, Stephen Witkoff's Gaza ceasefire proposal, and then he reneged on the deal. He embraced Mr. Trump's idea of redeveloping Gaza as a resort area, but now he's resisting Mr. Trump's idea of bringing humanitarian assistance into Gaza with American supervision rather than Israeli. Mr. Trump basically has told Mr. Netanyahu that, look, you have failed to solve the Gaza problem, and we will solve it for you. And so that on that issue, they are far apart. We have the Trump decision to drop the war with Yemen, but to do so in a way that does not require Yemen to stop bombarding Israel with missiles or conducting a blockade of the Red Sea against vessels bound for or to Israel. and from Israel. And so he has openly broken there with Israeli policy in a way that we've not seen Americans do for decades, really. And then finally, not finally, but just another indication, of course, in Riyadh, he met with Ahmed al-Shara, or al-Jilani, as the case may be, who he dropped the sanctions on Syria. Well, Israeli policy has always been to fragment Syria. The Israelis have just devastated Syria. The Israelis don't like the Turks operating in Syria. And Mr. Trump is now proposing to rebuild Syria. He's dropped the sanctions. He said he's working with the Turks in Syria. So these are all indications of a distancing between American policy and Israeli policy. And that is hardly surprising because the Israeli government is totally extremist, and it is engaged in outrages that have made it a pariah internationally, globally, and it's taken the United States, because we are very close to the Israelis, it has taken us with them. Our reputation has suffered huge damage. And Mr. Trump must have experienced some blowback from others resulting from the American identification with Israeli cruelty, sadism, and genocide. So he didn't go to Israel. This is a first for someone going to the region. And I think it's indicative of a desire to distance the United States from Israel to some extent, at least. It's almost a declaration of independence, because Israel has been calling the shots in Washington on everything related to West Asia for decades. Now, apparently, its influence is reduced.
And we had the deal between Hamas and the United States as well. And it doesn't seem that Netanyahu is so much in favor of that sort of behavior on the part of Trump administration. How important is that?
Well, I think it's very important. First of all, the direct discussions with Hamas have shown that it's possible to reach agreement with Hamas. The American negotiator reports that he found the people he met with surprisingly reasonable. They were able to agree on a number of things. Basically, what we have learned is that the path to peace it goes through direct discussion with your adversaries. And that shouldn't be a revelation. It's a common diplomatic understanding that you make peace with your enemies. You don't make peace with your friends. And you make peace with your enemies by talking to them, by reasoning with them, by extracting whatever concessions you can from them, and by convincing them that that they can live with you, and therefore they should not be your enemy. And of course, all of this is completely unobjectionable to Prime Minister Netanyahu and the extremists in his government. They want to destroy Hamas, of course. That's hardly surprising. But their way they plan to do it is to murder everybody in Gaza or throw them out. They haven't succeeded. The Israeli military reports that far from being defeated, the number of Hamas fighters has grown to about 40,000. This is at least double what they were on October 7th, sorry, when Hamas and others broke out of the concentration camp that they were confined to in Gaza. So Netanyahu's policy has not succeeded. And of course, this is Trump's breaking with him to some extent is arguably politically fatal to him, because his big argument for staying in power was that he had a unique ability to manipulate the United States and to get support from the United States for whatever he thought Israel should do. That is clearly not the case. Nonetheless, Mr. Trump continues the arms supply. So as Israel continues to conduct atrocities in Gaza, or in Lebanon, or in Syria, or in the West Bank, it has material support from the United States. So I don't think we can conclude that the Israeli-American relationship is over, but it has been somewhat curtailed.
I would wonder what is the perception on the part of Donald Trump when it comes to the West Asia, as you mentioned, to Saudi Arabia, to the Middle East specifically, what's going on in the Middle East. Do you think that in this visit that he what he's getting from the Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, from these countries, do you think that they're talking about Iran? And what would be the outcome of these sort of talks and the way that Saudis and Qataris view Iran?
Well, on the subject of Iran, all of them made it very clear that they do not want to be part of any war with Iran. And on the contrary, over the course of the last couple of years, the relationship between the Gulf Arabs and the Iranians has greatly improved. It now even embraces discussion of defense issues. We saw Khalid bin Salman, the son of the king, the brother of the crown prince, the defense minister in Saudi Arabia, go to Tehran for discussions with his counterpart and to meet the supreme leader. So the relationship between the two sides of the Gulf has changed fundamentally. And as I've said before, in many ways, rather than a coalition between Israel and the Gulf Arabs coming together to oppose Iran, we have the beginnings of a coalition between the Gulf Arabs and Iran to balance Israel, which is now the hegemon in the Levant. So on that subject, it's I'm sure there were discussions, but I'm sure they were cautionary and not encouraging in terms of any kind of warfare with Iran. If there is a war with Iran, and if the Gulf Arabs are in any way complicit in it, for example, offering overflights or bases or material support of any kind, Iran has said it will attack them. So this is a powerful deterrent. More broadly, you asked the question, why is Mr. Trump in the region? And I think I answered it with the statement that that's where the money is. That's where the money is. That's where the real estate development is. Mr. Trump likes money and he likes real estate development. And that is a lot of what he talked about in at least Riyadh and now Doha. And I suppose he will also talk about it in Abu Dhabi when he goes there.
Many people are talking about the airplane that Qatar is bought for Donald Trump. And do you think that Qatar is somehow trying to convince him in terms of the United States foreign policy in the region to be somehow justified, somehow modified, somehow being changed in favor of these Arab states?
I don't think this is transactional in that sense. There's no quid pro quo for the aircraft. This is a common habit in the Arab societies of the Gulf to treat a guest with gifts, generosity. It's intended to build long-term goodwill and favorable relationship. It is therefore a means of cementing influence, but it is not related to a particular transaction or event. So having said that, so this is not a bribe in the classic sense, but it is certainly an improper thing for the president to accept that aircraft. First of all, our Constitution bans the officers of the United States government, including the president, from receiving foreign emoluments, meaning gifts intended to influence their behavior. They're not allowed to accept titles of nobility either. If King Charles of Britain wants to confer a knighthood on Mr. Trump, the Constitution would preclude that, theoretically. Of course, Mr. Trump doesn't pay much attention to the Constitution. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there are rules of ethics in the U.S. government, which I'm very familiar with because it's why I left the Foreign Service even poorer than when I entered it. You cannot accept gifts. If you are given a gift, you have to turn it over to the government. In this case, the aircraft apparently is being given to Mr. Trump for his personal use, both while he's president and after his presidency, if indeed he ever steps down from the presidency. That is, it's a gift to the Trump Library, the Trump Presidential Library, which is interesting because I don't think Mr. Trump reads books. But anyway, this is caused a great deal of controversy in the United States. Even some of Mr. Trump's loyal Republican supporters are outraged by it. That doesn't seem to faze him at all. He clearly intends to accept the gift.
If I'm not mistaken, he received gifts from Saudi Arabia in his first term as well. But that's so common when it comes to Donald Trump.
It is the custom in the Gulf, and it's not unusual. Most countries do not have the constitutional bar to accepting gifts that the United States does. Well, anyway, Mr. Trump, as I said, leaves the lawyers to read the Constitution. He doesn't do it.
Yeah. Ambassador, when it comes to Gaza and what's going on in Gaza, it's so, we know that situation is not that good and people are suffering a lot. Do you think Donald Trump would be able to, after all, prevail Netanyahu and his desires in Gaza?
It's a hard question to answer because I know that Mr. Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, has reacted to all of the trends that I've discussed, where the United States is no longer doing his bidding, by saying that Israel is going to have to wean itself off dependence on American military support. I wonder who he thinks would substitute for the United States. I don't believe there's any country in the world that is willing to accept the moral taint of assisting Israel in genocide. So when we come to Gaza, where there is now mass starvation, and of course we have the Israeli spokesman for the military denying that there is a food shortage in Gaza. If you ever wanted a demonstration that the Israelis repeatedly lie about what they do, that is about as clear as you can get, because we can see the starvation. This is unusual. You know, Auschwitz was not televised, but Gaza is, and it's a Holocaust. And I think it's fair to say that by doing what it's done in Gaza, Israel has forfeited the defense that the Holocaust provided it. People didn't want to criticize Israel because of the sense that the ancestors of Israelis, Jewish Europeans, had suffered greatly at the hands of the other Europeans, and that we should give them a break and not criticize them. That's gone now. The entire world is critical of Israel. And here's a very interesting thing people have not thought about. Israel spent a huge amount of effort through its Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which is its instrument for Hasbara, the propaganda that it carries out. It has tried to equate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. And it has developed a standard that says criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. And now this is a very ironic situation, because the entire world is now critical of Israel, including a majority of Americans. So by Israel's standards, this means the majority of Americans are now anti-Semites. Well, this is, of course, absurd, but probably the most admired minority in American society is American Jews. So the most despised country now is Israel. Zionism and Judaism are not the same, and they never were. So Israel has instead of combating anti-Semitism, it is fomenting it, it is creating it, it is stimulating it, and it is causing the Jews everywhere in the world outside Israel to be in jeopardy, to be at risk. This is not good for Jews generally. I don't think it's good for Israel either, but that's another issue. Anyway, so I don't know what's going to happen with respect to Gaza. Clearly, Mr. Trump is prepared on occasion not to listen to Mr. Netanyahu or follow his direction. So we will see. These are two very big egos, Mr. Trump and Mr. Netanyahu, and this could be the political battle of the century.
Ambassador, you've mentioned the situation with al-Jolani in Syria, and Donald Trump said that he's going to lift all the sanctions in Syria. It seems that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was asking for that and was pushing for that. And do you understand, when we look at the way that Saudi Arabia was somehow sharing its concern with Iranians in the latest visit of the defense minister of Saudi Arabia, they were concerned about the case of Syria. And right now, the way that they're trying to solve that, somehow lift the sanctions on Syrians. How do you see these two pictures coming together?
Well, I think there's a common interest between Riyadh and Tehran in restoring Syrian sovereignty and independence, which have been badly battered by the Israelis. Neither Iran nor Saudi Arabia wants the Levant to be dominated by Israel. So there's a common interest there, and that's now, as I was saying, that instead of falling into opposition in an Israeli coalition with the Gulf Arabs are making common cause with Iran on certain issues. This is one of them. I would just say one other thing, and that is Saudi Arabia has emerged as a very important middle-ranking power. And you can see this in its hosting of talks between the United States and the Russians and Ukrainians, its offer of its own venues in Saudi Arabia for peacemaking. You can see it in the attention that Mr. Trump has paid to it, but not just Mr. Trump. Macron, the British, the Germans, the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, and Iran all take Saudi Arabia very seriously in a way that would not have been true 20 years ago. So whatever else he has done, Mohammed bin Salman has presided over a growth in Saudi Arabia's international influence. And I think this is part of a general evolution in the world order, which means that countries like Saudi Arabia or Iran or Turkey or Israel, for that matter, or the United Arab Emirates, in the new fragmented world order in which great powers contend but do not dominate as they did in the past, and other countries don't have to defer to great powers. They have more agency, they have more freedom of maneuver diplomatically, they have more ability to behave independently, and they can balance relations with the great powers by establishing relations with all of them. This is exactly what the Qataris have been doing, and it is now becoming a general phenomenon in global politics.
The other part of the conflict, and we know that Donald Trump is somehow, he wants to get out of the conflict as soon as possible, but it seems that as time goes by, it's getting much more difficult. We have the talks between Russians and Ukrainians in Istanbul. And first, Donald Trump talked about Vladimir Putin joining and all of that. It seems that wouldn't be the case. Even Lavrov is not going to be there. Two delegations, one from Russia and the other from Ukraine going to talk to each other. Zelensky right now is in Ankara, if I'm not mistaken. He talked with Erdogan. And do you think that the way that Russia sees these talks is because of they don't see any sort of progress on the part of Americans? That's why they're just somehow downplaying the talks in Istanbul?
No, I don't think that's it. I mean, I think actually President Trump and some of the people around him had a very inaccurate understanding of the realities of this war. They neither understood the origins of the war in the failure of the United States and NATO to respond to a request for diplomatic discussions with Moscow. And we've talked before many times that the Russians have posed three issues. One is the status of minorities in Ukraine, especially the Russian minority, Russian-speaking minority. They've now taken that issue basically off the table when they demand that the Russian-speaking areas become part of Russia, which constitutionally they've already declared they are. So let's leave that aside. But the two other issues, one is the restoration of Ukraine to the neutral status it had on its independence and no membership in NATO. And finally, the biggest issue of all, which is a reorganization of European security architecture to reduce the perceived threat to Russia and by Russia to others. All of this has been very clear from the beginning, and yet our media, our propaganda have repeatedly attributed to Russia all sorts of motivations and objectives, which the Russians don't appear to have. So if you go into a negotiation and your understanding of the other side's position and objectives is wrong, you don't get very far. So going in with a proposal for a ceasefire, as though the issue is the fighting, does not address the question of why the war occurred and how it must end. And also, I think in the case of the case of General Kellogg, the alternate mediator and envoy of the president, he had a very unrealistic view of the situation in terms of the weakness and isolation of Russia, neither of which are true. The Russian economy has done very well. Russia is not on the ropes militarily. On the contrary, it continues to advance. So these are realities that you have to recognize in order to have a negotiation. Now, negotiations of this sort and this complexity don't take place at the summit. Now, there has to be preparation. Now, that is normal diplomatic practice. Mr. Zelensky's effort to force a summit in Istanbul, it was basically a publicity stunt. This is not how problems get solved. So it's actually very good that lower level discussions are going to begin in Istanbul. And of course, Istanbul is where there was a virtual agreement reached in March 2022, and really within weeks of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia agreed to withdraw. That's why it left the effort. It abandoned the column pointed at Kyiv, and Ukraine agreed to be neutral, not join NATO. And there were some further issues to be discussed, but the basic outlines of an agreement were reached, and they were not reached between Zelensky and Putin. They were going to have a meeting to ratify this agreement, and that is appropriate. But there is no agreement to ratify yet. So it's a hopeful sign that they're talking. It's probably better not to talk than not to talk. But I think we should be very cautious about expecting any immediate breakthrough. And certainly there's going to be no ceasefire while the talks proceed. Ukraine would like that, of course, because it's losing the war. There's a great irony here I have to mention, and that is in the middle of all this, four European countries, Poland, Germany, France, Britain, go to Kyiv and issue an ultimatum to the Russians. Well, if you're losing the war, you can't issue an ultimatum. If you're winning the war, you might. The Russians haven't done that, thank God. But this is an example of fantasy foreign policy at work. I don't know if you have fantasy football in Brazil. I assume you do. But this bears no connection to what's actually happening in the field. And so I think we all need to wise up, get realistic. This war is not going to end with the recovery of Crimea or the Donbass, 4 oblasts in the Donbass region, eastern Ukraine. It is not going to end with Ukraine joining NATO. It is not going to end with that question remaining open. And it should end, in the interest of everyone concerned, with a discussion of the broader European security architecture. Because clearly, it is not in the interests of Russians or other Europeans to have their subcontinent divided into blocks or countries that confront each other. There needs to be a peace, in short. There cannot be an armistice.
I think that the way that you've drawn the talks between the two parties, I think after in March 2022, we didn't have any sort of direct talks between Ukraine and Russia. This is so much important.
Because the visit of Boris Johnson to Kyiv and his message to the Ukrainians and his support of the hardline ultranationalist Ukrainian position, which was uncompromising, when he said, well, you may be prepared to end the war, but we're not. We want to weaken and isolate Russia. Of course, he didn't say, using you would die to do that. We will not. But anyway, this led Vladimir Putin a week later to say, well, the discussions with the Ukrainians are off. They're finished. And of course, Mr. Zelensky issued a decree declaring any negotiation to be illegal. And so we're now in a phase where that at least begins to be overcome. And the obstacles to direct contact go away. I should say here that I think there is some evidence that the military in Ukraine and in Russia have always wanted to have an end to the war and have talked to each other somehow. And so the problem is not the military. They would happily stop dying on both sides. The problem is politicians. And those politicians are backed by very unrealistic expectations in Western Europe, among NATO members. And President Trump and Vice President Vance, to their credit, have broken with those fantasies and are trying to deal with this realistically. I think they're learning a lot as they go forward. Mr. Witkoff is an amateur, but he's a good negotiator, apparently. He listens, he learns, and he talks to the president. And the president is learning too.
Do you think that the new chancellor of Germany is somehow more aggressive, or what can we say about him? Because it seems to me it's just a situation that chancellor, this position has been worsening during the.
Yeah, well, I mean, Germany is internally very divided. And you can see that with the failure of Mr. Merz to be awarded the chancellorship in the first vote. It took a second vote. And you can see it with the attempts to ban dissident parties like Alternative für Deutschland, which, is more complicated than people want to admit. Of course, the Germans, have a psychological problem dealing with their past. And I would say that, it is not helpful to Germans to take an aggressive stance toward Russia. The Russians have some reason to remember the Germans not very fondly, like 28 million dead people, not all Russians, by the way, because it was the Soviet Union, and many of them were people were not part of the Russian Federation or independent. But it is, I don't think German foreign policy at the moment is very coherent.
Ambassador, do you believe that with these new talks, the Europeans are trying to somehow behind the scene convince Zelensky and manipulating the position of Zelensky? Because if we assume that these direct talks between the two parties would somehow be a step forward for any sort of Ukrainian settlement, is that going to facilitate the influence of Europeans on Zelensky?
I don't know how long Mr. Zelensky can last in office. I mean, I think he is an excellent actor. He was a professional comedian. He clearly has a commanding presence. He's done a great job of representing a particular viewpoint in Ukraine. Interestingly, that doesn't appear to have been his viewpoint when he was elected. It's somebody else's viewpoint, people in Western Ukraine, former Galicia, who have an appalling record of association with genocide of Poles, of Jews, association with the Nazis against the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation by succession. And he has represented their views very effectively internationally. I don't know what is going through the minds of Western Europeans. I think they are responding poorly to the withdrawal of the American dominance that enabled them for 80 years to neglect coming up with their own answers to European order. They have not put forward a single peace proposal. They don't have one. They have a proposal for some sort of military answer to Ukraine's security, but that won't work. I think the one thing that has to be absolutely kept alive, and as I understand it, is not objected to by the Russians, is that whatever remains of Ukraine, an independent, neutral Ukraine, should be free to join the European Union. And I think Europeans ought to focus on that, because the impediments to that are very large. They're not just corruption and the absence of democracy in Ukraine. The rule of law is not present there now. It is essentially a dictatorship under martial law. But that's not the only obstacle. There's also the question of whether countries like France, with a very large and assertive agricultural sector, would be willing to accept the Ukrainian agriculture in the EU, and on what terms. So I think the Europeans should be focusing on how to save Ukraine, not how to oppose the Russians. Because I think, in the end, as I've said before, and I firmly believe, Europe cannot be secure and at peace without an organic relationship between Russia as part of Europe and the rest of Europe. The great powers of Europe, Germany, Russia, France, UK, Italy, Spain, these countries have to be in some sort of concert for Europe to be peaceful. And that is the lesson of history. And dividing Russia from the rest of Europe, or excluding Germany, as we did after World War I, from a role in European affairs, is a grave mistake, and it has fatal consequences. In this case, the consequences have fallen almost entirely on Ukrainians. We don't know how many Ukrainians have died, but many estimates are well over 1 million died or severely wounded, disabled. And we know that a great number of Ukrainians, perhaps 11 million or so, have fled the country. Is Ukraine going to continue to exist? And if it does exist, what will its relationship with Europe be? how can it exist if it has a hostile relationship with Russia? A hostile relationship with Russia leads to tragedy, as we now see.
Just to wrap up this session, Ambassador, how do you see Hungary right now? We had in the news that Hungary is just shooting down Ukrainian drones, and they're not happy with Ukraine joining the EU and nor NATO. How can we understand the behavior on the part of the Orban and the Orban administration?
Well, Viktor Orban marches to his own drummer. He's always been quite independent in his thinking. He is a neighbor of Ukraine, and of course, one of the great issues between Hungary and Ukraine is that there are 150,000 Hungarian speakers in Ukraine who have, like the Russian speakers, been deprived of their cultural and linguistic autonomy. They seem to be very loyal Ukrainians in the sense that many of them have fought alongside other Ukrainians against the Russian invasion. But this is an issue, and it doesn't breed goodwill. Also, Mr. Orban, I think, understands very well what I just said, that Russia has to be part of Europe. It can't be excluded from it, and therefore does not support NATO's war on Russia through Ukraine, or Ukraine's desire to punish Russia and separate it from the rest of Europe. I suspect that if NATO, if Ukraine declared neutrality, that Mr. Orban could be persuaded to allow Ukraine to join the EU under certain conditions. But those conditions would be, as I indicated, quite strenuous, because it's not a foregone conclusion that Ukraine can qualify, either politically or economically. It is the